started so we can dig in. Oh, thank you for coming. The Tuesday before spring break, the middle of the semester when we're all barely able to hang on. Is that a fair assessment of where we all are? It's where I am anyway. And thank you to the audience members online for joining us. I know all of you, I think, probably know me by now, but just for the purposes of consistency, I'm Christy Barnwell, Associate Professor of History here, and I teach Middle East stuff. And so when coming up with this idea, I was thinking about, I think about organizing it around a single primary source document, a single document that can launch us into all kinds of different directions. And so what we're going to do today is look at the poem Identity Card by Mahmoud Darwish. And Mahmoud Darwish is sort of often referred to as Palestine's poet laureate. Sort of the voice, I've seen him referenced as the voice of the voiceless among Palestinians. And so Mahmoud Darwish himself is an individual that raises a lot of questions and themes and interests for us to talk about. And then his poem, Identity Card, provides us with other ways of thinking explicitly about how poetry functions in Palestinian society and how it provides us an opportunity for thinking about Palestinian feelings and sentiment at this moment in 1964 when he writes this poem, just before the 1967 war, where we have Israeli occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and an entirely new phase of thinking about Palestine in history. So if we'll hit the slide. So when we analyze documents, we often have to ask ourselves some very basic questions as historians. And we go through some basics: who, what, when, where, why should we care? And I'm going to do this out of order, but we want to know who the author of a document is. What do we know about them? What is the thing that we're actually looking at? What does the document tell us? When does the document originate, and what context does that provide for us? Where is there something located to the place that gives us more context? And then the why should we care? I'm going to do them out of order in ways that I prefer. But we're going to start with this question of why should we care? So in the United States, in our cultural experience, poetry has a lot of power, but it is seen as like a literary hobby, or as sort of in the broader zeitgeist. Smaller communities or niche subcommunities often point to poetry and its importance and its value, but it does not necessarily hold as constantly the kind of weight that poetry does in Arab culture and history and in the context of Palestine itself. There are moments when Americans all of a sudden pay a lot of attention to poetry. Maya Angelou reading a poem, and everybody has to read that in school. I'm thinking of Amanda Gorman, suddenly America's poet laureate, for a moment, and all of the interest and what this meant for politics and society, and a vision for what America could be like. And so we have these moments where we care about poetry. But in the context of poetry in Arab culture and in Palestinian culture, it has a huge amount of power as a historical document, as a reflection of identity, as sort of embedded in cultural resistance, commentary, documenting and remembering history, and so on. So poetry is powerful. Mahmoud Darwish's poetry is especially powerful because his poetry in particular provides expressions of Palestinian life under Israeli rule. And it provides us insights into Mahmoud Darwish's experience personally, as well as this snapshot into a regular everyday Palestinian and the Palestinian mood before the 1967 war. And we've talked a lot up to this point in the various previous sections about people in the West, Palestinians in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Mahmoud Darwish was a Palestinian, as we'll see, who lived in under the state of Israel, under the rule of Israel, in what was internationally recognized as the Israeli state. So we get both that experience and his experience in exile. And then Darwish's legacy as a voice of Palestine and humanity cannot be overestimated. He is this outsized voice. You can walk around and people will quote Mahmoud Darwish to you. We'll see that there's been instances of controversy within the government about the power and importance or the threat of his poetry if it's read. When I was a student in Jordan learning Arabic, this was one of the first poems that they introduced us to. I mean, it's just iconic in a lot of ways. And so the poem that we'll be looking at in particular is one that people know and recognize among a whole body of work that he's produced. So we'll go to the next slide. So now we're jumping to this question of who was the author of this poem, of this document. We're talking about Mahmoud Darwish. Darwish was born in 1942 in a town called Al-Birwa in the northern part of Palestine. So this was under the British Mandate of Palestine when he was born. And we'll look at a map here in a little bit. And then he would die in 2007 in Houston, Texas, while undergoing open heart surgery. He was a poet and a political activist. And I picked two quotes that I thought that resonated with me in terms of thinking about Mahmoud Darwish as an activist and as a humanist. The first of these is this idea that is something that he said: the Jew will not be ashamed to find an Arab element in himself, and the Arab will not be ashamed to declare that he incorporates Jewish elements. And so he really, living under the state of Israel, was very critical of Israel, but was adamantly in various ways would often say, I am not anti-Semitic. I love Jews as part of humanity. And he was very much a humanist in his approach to thinking about other people that he lived with and saw beauty in the ways these cultures combined and shared and diverged. And the other thing is that he was very much a political activist and was active, and his poetry reflects that. And he said poems, and I think he said this in 1996. He said poems can't establish a state, but they can establish a metaphorical homeland in the minds of the people. I think my poems have built some houses in this landscape. This is a statement of resistance to forgetting, of a communal dreaming of the creation of a homeland until a homeland could be created. And lots of scholars have written about the way in which Mahmoud Darwish's poetry is an ongoing active act of remembering and preserving Palestine and the Palestinian people and the Palestinian record. And as we will see, Darwish is not somebody you can categorize into any one group or other. He was a politician or like a political activist, but he refused to join political parties. And as we will see, he joined some parties, left other parties when they were not adhering to the values that he thought advanced the position of Palestinian people. So this is something, he was a flexible critical thinker, not an ideologue, not wedded to any one particular vision, but the advancement of Palestinian life in connection with the human existence. So we'll go ahead. I want to talk about the when and where of his life as a setting for and sort of contextualizing his work. And that means we're going to go back a little bit to 1948 and go through some various points in the timeline of his life. So he was born, as I said, in 1942 in a town called Al-Birwa, and that was near the city of Accra. And so this is the area, this is Accra here. It was just a little bit south of that. It was a village. And in 1948, in the Nakba, his family was displaced and fled to Lebanon. And in a sort of beautiful obituary by a friend of his, Elias Khoury, he wrote sort of describing what he understood as the history of this depopulation of Al-Birwa and attempts to return to it. So on 11 June 1948, the Carmeli Brigade raided the village of El Birwa and ejected its inhabitants, who took refuge in the neighboring fields. The people of El Birwa decided to go back to harvest their produce, and so they returned with canes and hoes and what arms they could muster on 22 June. But they handed the village over to the Arab Rescue Army, who in turn retreated before the Israeli army in July. So they fled, they tried to return, they handed over the protection of the village of El Birwa, the villagers did, to an Arab force. The Arab force retreated. And in the wake of that, Mahmoud Darwish and his family moved up to southern Lebanon, where they kind of wandered for a year or two. Where was it? Edward Said, also a friend and author, wrote in 1994 of Darwish that during this time period, he was a wandering, I jumped ahead. My notes got out of order. Okay, so that was in sort of a memory of or description of that moment. Mahmoud Darwish then talks about his experience in this period in an interview in 1996. He's speaking to this person. He says, "Do you recall the label infiltrators, that is, people who came back after 1948? I think the story of infiltrators has yet to be written, and a Palestinian author still needs to write this story." This is Mahmoud Darwish. "At the time of the establishment of the state, when they did a census, we were refugees in Lebanon. And when we returned about 2 years later, we entered as infiltrators. We arrived in the city of Deir al-Asad, near Accra, not far from where his home was. Every time the police came, we hid. Whenever the superintendent would come to the school, the teachers would hide me because I wasn't legal." So as a young child, he would describe in the years after 49, when his family kind of snuck back in, having to hide. And he goes on in this interview to talk about how traumatizing that was for him as a child in school, to have to hide constantly as he was growing up. His family, before the Nakba, were landowners, but when they returned to this area, they worked as laborers. He grew up learning, going to local schools until eventually he traveled around in Haifa. And then in 1970, he sort of traveled around to Russia, Lebanon, and Egypt. He tried to return in 1972-73, but he was banned from re-entering Palestine in 1973 because of his political activism. Saha, bless you. From this time period forward, his friend Edward Said, now I found myself in my notes, his friend and colleague Edward Said wrote that Darwish was, for this large portion of his life, a wandering exile, living in Arab capitals like Cairo and Tunis before settling in Paris. He eventually would settle in Amman, and then eventually was let back into Palestine, where he settled in 1995 in the city of Ramallah. And so between 1970 and 1995, he lived a life of exile. He eventually settled in Ramallah and then traveled between Ramallah and Amman and Paris and so on. But finally, he was in Palestine again. But remember that in 1995, Palestine, he was living in Ramallah in the West Bank. He was not allowed to return back and spend any significant amount of time in the area of Accra or Haifa. Sometimes he was allowed in for very short periods of time. There's in some of these interviews that, and the sources that are at the end of the PowerPoint presentation, they talk about these short windows when he was allowed to return for a funeral for 4 days, but then he had to leave. And it's sort of these stories of him having to exit sort of shadily to be able to get out safely without being arrested and so on. So it was always questionable as to whether he would be able to come back, return. I said also that he was a political activist. In the 1980s, 70s, and 80s, he joined the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, and he became part of the executive committee of the PLO and worked with Yasser Arafat and others. But he resigned from the PLO executive committee during the Oslo Accords. And a whole group of people working in high levels, including Hanan Ashrawi and Mahmoud Darwish, resigned in protest of the Oslo Accords that were negotiated in 91 and 94, no, 94 and 95, because he felt like they felt like Arafat made a deal that did not advance the cause of Palestinians. And he made that deal without really consulting with his executive committee and getting Palestinian buy-in. And so this was a reflection not of what Palestinians wanted. They thought he was basically giving away large chunks of Palestine. And so in a couple of 2 sessions from now, we'll talk about the Oslo Accords in more depth. But I wanted to point out Mahmoud Darwish was constantly in pursuit of humanity and in pursuit of the Palestinian mission, and not sort of wedded to any specific party or ideology beyond, I think, his humanism and his sense of respect, self-respect and value of the Palestinian community and identity. He ultimately, his work is considered significant for a variety of reasons. The next one is the poem itself, right? Okay. His work is incredibly powerful. In 1988, one of his poems led to a debate in the Knesset, that is sort of the place of government, the parliament for Israel, over whether or not it was acceptable to have this poem recited in various places. His poetry, Edward Said wrote, one of his poems expressing a harsh, exasperated view of Israel was debated in the Knesset. So powerfully did his tones address the other, that is the Israeli public, that in 1988, this poem expressed such exasperation that Israeli government members felt like it needed to be addressed as an issue of government. Later on in the 90s, it would launch another debate when the Israeli government's education program sought to bring in 1 or 2 of his poems into the Israeli curriculum, led to another level of debates about whether or not it was safe in Israel to bring his poetry in, or whether or not that would harm sort of Israel and the narrative of the state of Israel. Another scholar on this question of exile, and then we'll come to the poem or exile and then his death. So Dr. Khalid El-Swamiya writes of the idea of exile that Mahmoud Darwish evokes the entire experience of exile as a universal human condition at the heart of his poems, not just a Palestinian one, but a universal human condition at the heart of his poems. And that Mahmoud Darwish dedicated all his energy to underline Palestinians' constant dislocation, dispossession, and deprivation of a dignified human life. Darwish's poetics of desire, in fact, struggles against forgetfulness. It endeavors to reconstruct memories of his homeland. It acts as historical record, portraying the baneful history of his people under colonial hegemony. It reflects the communal desire for freedom. And so that's one sort of scholar's commentary on the power and importance of his voice and the kind of work that he did. He died in 2007. As I said, he was undergoing surgery. And again, his friend Elias Khoury writes that there were 2 people who created the Palestinian language. The first, he's referencing Ghassan Kanafani, the first was a novelist from Accra who became a refugee in Syria and then Lebanon, where his body was fragmented in Mezimiya, not far from Beirut. That is, he was killed in an explosion from Israeli forces while he was in exile in Lebanon. The second was a poet from Al Birwa near Accra, who took refuge in Lebanon in 1948, only to sneak back into Galilee after his family spent a year in the snows of Jizan, that region. Kanafani was killed by the Israelis Darwish exploded from within. So sort of this beautiful kind of, evocative imagery of these two poets or these two authors who wrote in prose and poetry to sort of form the boundaries of or the basis of Palestinian exile and experience. And I would encourage anybody and everybody to read either or both of their works. So we're going to now sort of talk very carefully about Identity Card and read through it. But before we do that, I'm going to ask Courtney to hit play on the YouTube video. So we'll get to hear, we're only going to listen for a few moments, but we'll get to hear a little bit of Mahmoud Darwish's voice in Arabic as a recording as he speaks the first lines, the first stanza or two of his poem. So we'll get a chance to hear him speak. So if you could. Thank you. So this, so one of the things that's, we'll talk a little bit about the form of this poem. Arabic poetry traditionally follows a very specific formula historically, a very specific formula and a pattern of rhyming. And his early poetry followed that traditional pattern. But from the 70s onward, he got in more and more into the liberation of language through free verse. And so this poem, like many of his other poems, reflects this transition to free verse in sort of going through and following the rhythms but freeing sort of the structure of the structure of the poem. He writes this, as I said, in 1964. And what we're going to see a little bit, he repeats over and over again, will you be angry? But he then turns into sort of, if you're not, a warning about the anger that could bubble up from Palestine and among Palestinians, which is something we'll see in the wake of 1967, when Palestinians finally come to sort of believe they have to take their fate into their own hands. The Arab armies are not themselves going to liberate Palestine, right? So we'll start off with how he begins. Sigil, write down, ana Arabi. And so I'll point to that sound, that ayn sound is a distinctly Arabic kind of sound. It's a very difficult one to say. And there are a lot of letters in Arabic dialect as an expression that are hard to say. And so they get in combination. And so they get elided or softened in various dialects. But as one of my Arabic teachers in Texas would say, the ayn is distinctly Arab and it will not go away. And so over and over again, you hear this strong like ayn sound repeated as he affirms that he is an Arab, that he's an Arabi, and he is in this poem facing an Israeli soldier or bureaucrat who's registering him. Okay, so he says, write down, I am an Arab and my identity card is number 50,000. And I have 8 children and the 9th will come after a summer. Will you be angry? That 50,000, that number 50,000 is meant to sort of reflect both a sense of anonymity, that it could be one of many, many numerous numbers that is his identity card, but also sort of the vastness of the experience of Palestinians, and also sort of while also reflecting this idea that they are numbered, they are tracked, and they have to go to these Israeli bureaucrats for whatever it is that he's asking for. I have 8 children, and the 9th will come after a summer. Will you be angry? Talking about family, the production, the continuous production of children, the continuation of Palestinian existence through the creation of more family. And he says, will you be angry? Angry because by the 60s, even from the founding of Israel, there was a demographic question. Will you be angry that I'm going to have more children, that we are going to persist? Are you going to be angry that we will continue to expand the Palestinian population, that this demographic question threatens the existence of a Jewish state by just being more numerous? Write it down. I'm an Arab, employed with fellow workers at a quarry. I have 8 children. I get them bread, garments, and books from the rocks. I do not supplicate for charity at your doors, nor do I belittle myself at the footsteps of your chamber. So will you be angry? So he's saying, I do honest work and I get my money from rocks, and I will do this honest, hard work to get what I need for my family. And he emphasizes that he will not lose his dignity. He will not supplicate for charity. He will not beg of the Israelis that they give him what he needs to survive. And I will not belittle myself at the footsteps of your chamber. I will not come to your chamber and beg, right? So will you be angry? Will you, Israel, this Israeli bureaucrat, will you be angry at my continued expression of dignity? Write it down. I am an Arab. I have a name without a title, patient in a country where people are enraged. My roots were entrenched before the birth of time and before the opening of the eras, before the pines and the olive trees and before the grass grew. I'm just a person without a title. I am not some great dignitary. I'm not fancy. I am just a person, patient in a country, and describes language where people are mad, but I'm going to hang out. I'm going to endure. And his roots reflecting the idea of trees, right? Which he then echoes at the end of that stanza. His roots sort of reach down. They were entrenched so far back, right? Echoing to his history, the indigeneity of the Palestinian people, the long history of being there, of perpetually being there, right? Of laying claim on the basis of Palestinians being there. My father descends from the family of the plow, not from a privileged class. And my grandfather was a farmer, neither well-bred nor well-born. Teaches me the pride of the sun before teaching me how to read. And my house is like a watchman's hut made of branches and cane. Are you satisfied with my status? I have a name without a title. Reflecting his own family history, his father and his grandfather, these generations of working the land, and sort of naming that connection, not only to the land, but the people who came before him, recalling the name of the people, of the families who, and remember, remembering names is important. Especially when you're in exile, especially when you're under the control of other people, a name and the name of the people who came before you gives him a sense of continuity with his culture. And in defying the losing of that, right, he is resisting the erasure of what the Israeli government would want him to do, like forget the connection to this long history, wanting to erase that to lay claim to Israel's own claim of the state. Neither well-bred nor well-born, teaching me the pride of the sun before teaching me how to read. His family taught him how to appreciate the land, the sun, nature, as well as the literary things that we have to know to be successful as human beings. And his house is like a watchman's hut. It's a basic hut. It's not anything fancy. And he says, are you satisfied with my status? Are you happy that you have put us in this state, that you have left us in this state with this tiny house? But I remember my name and my family and our connection to this land, our connection to the trees going way back. And he says again, I have a name without a title. Write down, I am an Arab, You have stolen the orchards of my ancestors and the land which I cultivated along with my children, and you left nothing for us except for these rocks. So will the state take them, as it has been said? You have now he's shifted from remembering and asserting who he is and who the Palestinian people are, and turning it on. What are you going to do? Are you going to further? You've already stolen from us. Are you going to steal further? Are you going to leave us nothing except for rocks? Remembering that the one thing that he still has is the ability to earn an honest living and provide a dignified life for his children. Are you going to take even that away from me, this miserable work? And the state, right? Not the Jewish people. The state is what he says was trying to claim this from him. So will the state take them? And as it has been said, the state has already threatened to take even this, what's left. Therefore, he says, write down on the top of the first page, I do not hate people, nor do I encroach. But if I become, this is not all of the poem. Somehow things got snipped. Dang, I was on a roll and something got snipped. Okay. My grandfather was a farmer teaching me and my house, like the watchman said, write down, you've stolen except for these rocks. Will the state take them? Write down on the top of the first page. I do not hate people. Nor do I encroach. But if I become hungry, the usurper's flesh will be my food. Beware, beware of my hunger and my anger. So now he's saying, if you take the rocks, the last thing that you will leave us with is starvation. And if I become hungry, I have not taken from you. I have not harmed you. But if you leave me with nothing but hunger and starvation, then what else will be left but the usurper's flesh, that is the state's flesh? And so beware of my anger, beware of lowering our dignity and our status to such a degree that I am so hungry, and then you will see my anger. No, it didn't steal all of the, it worked. Okay. All right. So that is the poem. And that is, again, it's like we've got an internal clock. All right. So let's talk questions, thoughts, reflections. Are you going to run off and go for poetry?
What's the name of the other author that we read?
His name is Rashad Kanafani. He is most famous for Oranges in the, no, not Oranges, Men in the Sun, which is a really awful, terrible short story. But his name is Rashad, Ghassan Kanafani, Kanafani. And if you like prose, his short stories in particular are incredibly powerful and short, and tell stories of Palestinians in exile in a wide variety of places. There are a few other, I mean, there's lots of poets. If you do a Google search, or whatever search engine of your choice, you will find a lot of reference to Palestinian poets, Palestinian poetry, several of whom have sort of been immortalized as in their death from this latest, in the current onslaught. So there's a lot of it floating around right now that's easy to capture, but Mahmoud Darwish is sort of this long legacy, but many poets have followed in sort of some of the material that he's provided. Other questions?
Mentioned like that, like this is kind of around the time when he started shifting to like free verse in his poetry and kind of breaking away from like traditional poetry form. So like I guess how did that kind of like show up in his other poems then? So like this kind of structure, were they like pretty different from this? Like did they?
They can be quite different. So when you're looking at sort of older, and I'm not an expert in sort of older poetry, and classical poetic tradition, but it uses it's a much more very, um, structured, like each stanza is the same, sort of length, and it uses the same rhyme meter, and it uses a repetitious sort of ending of each line sort of repeats over and over again. So he was already starting to shift away, from that kind of structure with this. So some of his poems can be quite long, some of them quite short, some of them can be, have sections that look more like a long kind of, sort of longer, wider verse. But he didn't do, I don't know that I've seen a whole lot of it where he's like played around with the structure of the poem and the movement of the words across the page and that kind of thing. But more just sort of breaking away from this, very classical structured rhyming.
So mentioned how poetry is more like ingrained in culture, and I find that fascinating. And I was wondering, like, if how does that, like, how is that kind of approached in the culture, like as far as education goes, as far as like
People, so, and it's not just Palestinians, it's Arab culture, at large. So I could tell you, like when I was doing my graduate work, my Jordanian friends, and I was visiting Jordanian friends, when I was living in Abu Dhabi, and they were living in Abu Dhabi, and we would hang out of an evening. Well, they were in Al Ain, and we'd hang out of an evening because it got too hot and it was cool outside. So we just sit outside, and the brothers would like recite poetry to one another, like to see who they could, or just like develop verse on the fly as like a competition among themselves for fun. I mean, we were in our 20s and they would just do that. And mom's sitting there deciding who's winning and who's losing in this moment, right? They have like, you know, we've got America's Got Talent and you go on and you sing or whatever, perform. They have poetry competitions. And you can watch competitions of poets throwing verses back and forth or sort of performing poetry for an award. I mean, it is just, poetry is just throughout, like memorizing verses of the Quran, memorizing verses of poetry. You'll just be hanging out with somebody and they can start reciting some of their favorite poems and poetry as like, just like something that it reminds them of. Yeah. Yeah. It's lovely. It's just, you know, I think a lot of times when I teach about a little bit about this in my regular class, students are like, why are we learning so much? Like, why would poetry cause so much debate? And it's because it's never not. It's so foundational and important to the idea of Arab culture. Historically, like in ancient times, I mean, it was, a way of sort of keeping track of your family lineage, the battles of your tribe, and the wars that you won, right? These epic poems that sort of described the history of your family, your tribe, and your success. And that has continued on through today. A lot of poetry right now, within Palestinian culture, it is often about remembering aspects of the culture, remembering aspects of the family, persisting in violence and as forms of daily resistance, as well as forms of like, it is hard to find a poem that is not about, conflict, dislocation, exile, violence, or liberation. It is, because I've tried. It's like some days I'm like, can I just find something that celebrates Palestinian life without that? And it is harder to find because it is so pervasive as part of the culture and tied up in the poetry itself. Yeah. Other questions, comments, thoughts? Well, thank you everyone for again taking time out of a Tuesday. I'm honored to have you all in the room with me and on the screen with me. So thank you very much. And hopefully we'll come back rested and ready to talk about something a little more structured in the form of the Hamas charters and the Oslo Accords on the other side of spring break.